So I'm just going to introduce our panel, and then each one will share some thoughts and insights for about 7 to 9 minutes. For our pulpit rabbis, a minute is a 60-second unit of time. And then we will have some opportunity for conversation and questions. So firstly, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rona Novick. She is the Dean of the Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, Yeshiva University, and holds the Rain and Stanley Silverstein Chair in Professional Ethics. Dr. Novick serves as co-educational director of Hidden Sparks, an initiative to support diverse learners in Jewish day schools. In addition to teaching, supervision, and administration at Azrieli, she brings her experiences as an educator and clinical psychologist to work with schools, communities, and individuals to promote the social-emotional development of children. She's the author of numerous articles and chapters on bully prevention, building resilience, and parenting.
Wow.
As well, we have with us Rabbi Menachem who is the Max and Marion Grill Dean of the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary and the Men's Undergraduate Torah Studies Program at Yeshiva University. Rabbi Penner served as the spiritual leader of the Young Israel of Holliswood in Queens for 20 years. He received his smicha from REITs and his BA from Yeshiva College. And Rabbi Penner is involved in the training and development of rabbis that ultimately take leadership positions across North America. Of course, Dr. Novick as well is involved in the training and development of Jewish educators who are serving in schools across North America. Today with us as well is Dr. Avi Helfand, who is an expert on religious law and religious liberty, a frequent author and lecturer. His work considers how the state treats religious law, custom, and practice. He is currently an associate professor at Pepperdine University School of Law and co-director of Pepperdine University's Diane and Guilford Glazer Institute for Jewish Studies. Dr. Helfand received his JD from Yale Law School and his PhD in political science from Yale University. In addition to his academic work, Professor Helfand is an executive board member of the Bet Din of America, where he also serves as a consultant on the enforceability of rabbinic arbitration agreements and awards in U.S. courts. And we have with us as well Rabbi Shaul Robinson. The Robinsons celebrated the engagement of their son this past week, last night. Rabbi Robinson was installed as the senior rabbi in Lincoln Square Synagogue in September of 2005. Rabbi Robinson was born in Scotland in 1967 and earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Economics and Political Science at a university in Scotland, a city I can't pronounce. He was also awarded a Master's of Business Administration with distinction from the University of Nottingham, England. His MBA focused on the management of non-for-profit institutions, and his dissertation was titled The Working Lives of Rabbis. Rabbi Robinson's smichas are from the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, Rabbi Riskin and Rabbi Bravender, and also Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. Rabbi Robinson is a prominent rabbi in the American scene, and somebody who has certainly, both Rabbi Robinson and Dr. Helfand have certainly extended their influence from their places of work throughout the broader world through the mediums of social media and all sorts of other opportunities in the world of tomorrow. And so we will begin our program with hearing from Dr. Novick.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you, with my esteemed colleagues. As a psychologist, I thought I would start first by going to my shelf and looking at some of the theories of how man deals with rapid change. And I came across something that I want to share with you, and then I'll tell you its source. The final qualitative difference between this and all previous lifetimes is the one most easily overlooked, for we've not merely extended the scope and scale of change, we have radically altered its pace. We have in our time released a totally new social force, a stream of change so accelerated that it influences our sense of time, revolutionizes the tempo of daily life, and affects the very way we feel the world around us. We no longer feel as men did in the past. Now, if I showed you what this was Xeroxed from, the reason it looks orange is it's because it's from the yellowed pages of my copy of Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, which was first published in the late 60s. I wasn't reading it then, but in the 70s in high school, it was assigned reading. And if that's what we were talking about in terms of the rapid escalating pace of change in technology then, you can only imagine what it is like to live and to lead in today's world. And I think that for us in the Jewish world, we have an additional wrinkle, an additional challenge, in that we are looking for leaders, of course, who innovate, and of course who can connect with modernity, but at the same time, we do not want them to eschew the traditions that are core and critical to who we are as individuals and as a people. I also think that we are challenged to create in today's climate of entitlement, and there's scores written about the sociology of young people today and millennials and the me generation, and there's actually a lot of talk now about what we're going to label the next generation. Are they going to be called the only me generation? Are they going to be called the me and you generation? How are we going to define the next iteration of a generation? But I think we have to think, as we talk about preparing people for leadership, how do we prepare people for the notion of serving rather than being served in a climate where the expectation of do for me, give me, get me is fairly well established. But I think that specifically as somebody who teaches leaders, and in fact our doctoral program is here today attending sessions, I thought about what are the tools that we need to gift today's burgeoning leaders with in order for them to succeed. And I've identified what I think are 4 sets of tools that are critical for leaders to be successful. And I would argue or suggest that this is true whether they're rabbinic leaders, whether they're lay leaders, whether they're educational leaders, whether they're in any field. But first and foremost, a leader cannot lead today without techno tools. And by that I do not mean that you need to know the latest this and every iteration of software that comes out, because nobody other than the biggest tech geeks can master them, and maybe my 2.5-year-old granddaughter, who does them all faster than I master them. But it's not a particular program or platform that you need to know. It's the idea of how to communicate and to connect through technological means, how to access and learn and use new technologies to reach the masses. I heard a politician talking about campaigning before the railroad and campaigning today. And the mechanisms that grew up around politics in this country that were totally tied to how we communicate and the limits of communication. Well, the same is true of any type of leadership now. But techno tools are not sufficient. We also need people tools. In neuropsychological understandings, there's something called social cognition. And within the area of social cognition, there's actually something called political acumen. It doesn't refer to whether you're a good mayor or a good candidate for office. It means, do you know how to say the right thing to the right person in the right situation that allows you to connect in a genuine and authentic way? Can you read not just a room, but an individual? Can you process people's feelings? Can you speak to their hearts and their souls? And we need to train leaders, to educate leaders in how to do that. But we also need leaders to develop a set of cognitive tools, a set of mind sets or mental tools and mental maps that allow them to see themselves and the world in a way that is consistent with effective leadership. Carol Dweck is probably one of the most famous names associated with the idea of mindsets and the notion of a growth mindset. We cannot have leaders who fail to understand the infinite human potential that can be unleashed when we impart a growth mindset from nursery to earliest ages and through to our most senior of citizens. We need leaders who understand how minds work, how mindsets are inculcated and created in young people. And my bias is that it's way too late to start doing leadership education in high school, and certainly in adulthood, that we should be engaging students around autonomy and authentic efforts to change the world as early as they can and as early as we can. It takes some adjusting. You can take high school students and engage them in a food drive And high school students will understand that the can of food that I give is going to do some use to someone who's hungry. If you're going to do that with preschoolers, then you need to take them with you to the food pantry. And they need to see that can of food opened and served. So it needs adjustment at young ages, but there's no reason to wait. It's too late to wait. And the last set of tools I'd like to suggest that we need to provide all leaders with and all potential leaders with are self-understanding and self-care tools. It is lonely at the top. It's even lonely near the top. It is something I hear from not only rabbis, but from rebbitzins, from principals and educational leaders about the struggles that they have to deal with their own issues of anger and alienation, of competing pressures, of juggling family, communal, personal, and job responsibilities. And no one will be successful if we do not think about providing people in their educational programs with the tools that allow them to understand, to recognize, to be able to take themselves out of the equation. We had a shorthand when my children were growing up in my house. The shorthand for Ima being at her wit's end as the family leader was that I'm going to Hawaii. When I said I'm going to Hawaii, that told my husband, he's on. He's on and I'm gone. And our sons very quickly would say, how does she get there so fast? Isn't Hawaii far? And when is she coming back? But that was my self-care tool, which stood me in very good stead as a parent. Last but not least, we really need to, starting today, this is not about tomorrow, this is about today, because if we don't do this today, we will have nobody interested in becoming educational, rabbinic, or communal leaders in the future. We need to value our institutions, and we need to value the people that lead them and that lead us. We need to stop using every Shabbat table as an opportunity to talk about what people did wrong and start finding ways to celebrate the incredible efforts of those in our community who give of themselves so that we can have the resources and the vibrant, engaged Jewish lives that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to speak, specifically after Dr. Novick. I get to speak with her on many panels, and I always ask to speak after she speaks, because she sets the table. My job is sort of to speak a little more practically about some of the things that perhaps can be done. I have the privilege of working with a team of people that get to train, particularly the rabbis of the future. And the question is, how do you take these four ideas? How do you practically implement rabbinic training? There's many trainings that could be spoken about, but specifically rabbinic training in a world that's changing so quickly. There are four things that I think that we have to keep in mind. First of all, the pace of change itself requires us to be looking at our curriculum on really a monthly basis, not a decade by decade basis, not a yearly basis, but literally on a monthly basis. There are many who assume that the rabbinic training of today is probably somewhat similar to what they had 30 or 40 years ago in the rabbinate. Of course, that would never fly today. The rabbis get an enormous amount of very practical training, up and down, speaking, counseling, self-development, but that has to literally be looked at monthly. Our director of professional rabbinics, Rabbi Larry Rothwax from TNEC, we meet weekly, and at least once monthly, we're going to be looking at what is covered in all of the different courses. Are we actually hitting all of the issues of today? Things change so quickly that you can't even wait for a yearly review of the curriculum. We have to have a certain amount of flexibility within the courses themselves to try to be able to keep up. The registrar's office at Yeshiva University, who is responsible for signing off that students have finished smicha, wants to kill us, because there are no smicha, very set smicha requirements, especially when it comes to professional rabbinics. We change it just about every year, and there has to be a lot of asterisks in the catalog. But we're not going to allow the slow pace of registrars, so to speak, and New York State to hamper our rabbis getting what they really need, which is to be able to see the issues as they come up. We cannot predict what the big issues are going to be next year, societally, religiously, socially, community-wise, and therefore we need to be able to move very quickly. Perhaps, however, even more important than staying up to date with the technology, with the trends, with the halachic issues that are posed, is the embracing of change in and of itself. Because the reality is that even though I can try to teach my students what the issue of today is, it won't be the issue by the time they get out in 3 years. So part of what we have to train our students is to be able to embrace change, embrace a certain amount of uncertainty, to be able to understand their classes in entrepreneurship, in how to think out of the box, in how to take a different step. One of the things that we try to do more and more is, instead of having rabbis present what's going on in the field, to have people from the field, people in shuls, people who are facing particular issues, people who are facing different mental health issues, to have them present directly to the students. And part of why that's so important, other than the fact that it's so powerful, is it teaches that you have to keep doing that. You can't have rabbis. I get to be the dean. I've been out of the practical rabbinate now for a whopping 2 years, having become a rabbi emeritus 2 years ago. I'm already way behind in the field. We need to be hearing from people who are at the front lines to make that happen. We also try, number 3, besides changing the curriculum constantly and teaching the students how to embrace change going forward, is to try to give them an understanding that with every new development there are challenges and there are opportunities, especially when it comes to social media. To constantly remind our students, we have classes, of course, in how to best utilize social media, but also to understand that social media is supposed to be a means and not an end. Social media tends to be often very one-sided, not very sophisticated, a very surface kind of way of approaching an issue. And to have our students understand that the way to reach people may be through social media, but it's probably not in 140 characters. Right? It's very difficult to explain the kind of Yiddishkeit that we're about in our community, to explain that in 140 characters or even 280 characters. So as all of these things come up, to tell them, take a good look at it, hear the voices. We bring in people sometimes to the rabbinic classes that the students don't always agree with. But it's important to be able to hear from people who have a different view, and then to understand, how does that sync? How do they have the relationships with the Rosh Yeshiva that they can then take that and go forward? We have, for example, so many of the students working on other college campuses. There are, it turns out, other college campuses besides YU. So many of the JLIC educators from the OU are now YU Musmachim. And every year we bring them back to campus. And the goal is not just to give them a little training and to give them a hug, because it's hard to be out there alone, but there are 2 critical sessions that they have. Number 1, with the Rosh Yeshiva. They sit with the Rosh Yeshiva and say, what's going on now on other college campuses? And then with our own students, what do you need to know about what's going on there? As much as YU has a wonderful growing student body, it's not the majority of the future of the Jewish community. It never was, it never will be. There are many out there, many Jews on many campuses. So number 3, I think, is to be able to try to constantly hear what's going on, but also understand how to negotiate it. And finally, I think, is to give them the tools to deal with the challenges of an ever-changing environment and the challenges of a fast-paced environment. We're looking very strongly at rabbinic burnout. Which I assume you'll hear a little bit of rabbis who aren't burnt out, but but they see their colleagues. It is 2-3 years in the rabbinate is a decade of what once was in terms of the volume of the stuff that comes through. We've invested heavily in trying to train the rabbis to learn about themselves. Whereas there was a counseling center that would be available if you wanted to talk to somebody. Right now, if you're going into the shul rabbinate, you're basically going through group therapy in smicha, individual therapy in smicha. We spend a tremendous amount of time. There's a team of mental health professionals who are working with the rabbis to understand themselves, as Dr. Novick said, because that's going to be critical for a lot of the things I spoke about. To understand, to embrace change, to understand in the very difficult world of what do you say, one word can make a difference. Rabbis are going to need to understand themselves, what makes them tick, their trigger points, in a much, much different way than ever before. I'll conclude by saying that we're actually taking this to a new level this week. All of the third and fourth year rabbinical students who are heading into the pulpit, high stress, potentially principal jobs, are all going to be taking a standardized test in emotional intelligence called the Mesquite. A standardized test in emotional intelligence, and some of our team of mental health professionals have been trained in Yale as to how to work with the test. The test is not for me. The administrators will never know how the students do. They're not there to allow the students to continue or not continue. But the team of mental health professionals who work together will be able to understand the test and for the first time be able with data to turn to students and say, this is something where you have a challenge. How are we going to teach you to compensate for this thing? Whether Dr. Novick talked about understanding a room, understanding how I respond. So a completely different level. I can't say I had a little bit. I had nothing even that compared to this when I came through the program. We're going to have a very, very different kind of rabbi, please God, who really understands. The group I think that's most at risk are the fuddy-duddies like myself. And I think that that's going to really be much of the work that Rabbi Glasser's doing to try to the continuing education. I think the group that's sometimes going to have the biggest challenge with this are the rabbis already in the field, who are not themselves millennials, who are not themselves necessarily so familiar with many of the new advances. And we hope to be able to reach out to them as well.
Pleasure to be here with you, I guess now this afternoon. I think Rabbi Robinson and I have a slightly different charge. We're supposed to speak more directly about wielding influence in a global world. And I thought I'd start with a diagnosis. And here's what my diagnosis is. I think the defining feature of contemporary influence is the role of content in the information age. By content, I mean things like articles, blog posts, podcasts, videos. And what I'd like to propose to you is that in the information age, content is king. Content itself, by its substance, has the power to influence, but it's also amplified by the information age. It allows the author or creator to reach unseen audiences. Now, on one level, if content is indeed king, this should be wonderful news for the Jewish community. We've always influenced through content. That's how we roll. That's our national calling card. We're the people of the book. So this is a great development. And I'd even suggest that that's particularly true for the modern Orthodox community. In the information age, you have the circulation of information across borders, boundaries, communities. You have the speeding up of interaction between disciplines, and especially the engagement of the religious and the secular at an increasing speed. Information travels both inside religious communities to outside religious communities and vice versa far faster than it ever has before in ways that really dovetail with our first two speakers here this morning. At all these points, people, audiences, they're looking for someone to explain what's happening, a form of translation. How do these two pieces of information work together? What does the event in the world mean for my community? And modern orthodoxy, notwithstanding Rabbi Sachs this morning, his slight ambivalence regarding the term, the modern Orthodox community is particularly well suited to meet these challenges of the information age, to translate information from one sphere to another, from one community to another. The information age enhances the capacity of the modern Orthodox community to educate. But content also influences in another way, beyond merely conveying substance. Content changes our perception of people. People who develop content don't just influence, they become influencers. People start to see them differently, to think of them differently. And the more popular the content, the more it can raise a person's profile and their platform. Creating popular content can transform educators and commentators into thought and community leaders. Here's the rub. People are highly incentivized for these reasons to create popular content. For some, that means spreading content that has great value to educate the world. For others, it means creating content that allows them to secure influence and power. And so you get two very different paradigms of content in the information age. You get thoughtful content, content that educates an audience, translates from sphere to sphere, conveys important halachic and hashkafic insights. But you also get clickbait, sometimes inflammatory content, content meant to grab attention instead of educate. Here's the problem. The problem is both of these tactics work. So genuine teachers and commentators can use content to engage and educate audiences. And headline seekers can also consolidate influence and power through vacuous, controversial, attention-grabbing content. And both groups can use that content not just for the content to influence, but to become influencers and community leaders, even those deploying content for the mere sake of securing power and influence. And this, to me, is the dangerous thought at the bottom of the information age. And it's one of the primary challenges about wielding influence in the global world, so I thought I'd give 3 responses to the challenge. 1, I think we need to think clearly about what it means to create positive, Jewish, modern Orthodox content. People will quibble, as they always do. That's our job. But here are a few basic guidelines. Here's what positive content, I think, is. It enhances Shmirat HaMitzvot and Ahavat Hashem. It educates an audience, provides them with the tools to understand the world. It translates the world, explains how different contemporary events outside the Jewish community matters to us, and conveys to those outside our community how our values ought to be relevant to the world around them. Some of these characteristics can, at times, end up in conflict, but they're a good starting point, and we need a starting point because it's vital to think more clearly about what typifies positive content, given that it not only influences, but creates influencers. Second, we need to police our communal infrastructure to make sure we're not promoting the wrong kind of content and, as a result, the wrong kind of people. Think about your shul's program committee. It invites speakers. Which speakers does it choose to invite? Are you giving a platform to the right kind of influencers? People whose content improves halachic commitment or hashkafic aspirations, people who educate? Or do you bring people into your shuls and schools based upon their quasi-celebrity status, because they've got a big name, because they speak in ways that grab attention, even if they do so in ways that are incongruous with our communal values and ethics? Invitations to our most treasured institutions are a central piece of content's infrastructure. The platform we give people amplifies their voice and accelerates their path to communal leadership. And so we need to make good choices. Third, given that content paves the road to influence and leadership, we need to create more opportunities for the right kind of people. And we need to identify those people, and we also need to build the right kinds of places and spaces for those people to produce content. This means thinking strategically and on a communal level. We need to promote younger rabbis and younger educators to find a voice. And we need to promote both men and women so we have leaders in the world of tomorrow that can inspire the entirety of our community. And it means building platforms where these people can grow into leadership roles. Let me give a concrete example. Last year, a group of young educators, rabbis, academics, got together to create a new website. They called it the Lair House. And their goal was to provide thoughtful, engaging content of interest to the Jewish community. They asked me if I'd join, and I said yes, even I had no clue what they were talking about. For a year, the site has produced Jewish content on education, politics, culture, geared for a general audience. I have honestly been shocked at the response. 20,000 people a month at least visit the site. This month it'll probably be 30. We get more and more people looking to write, and that's all really great. And content is wonderful, but that's not what really matters. What really matters is, as I watch this evolving, I find people increasingly talking about the people we publish, inviting them to their shuls, reading what they write in other contexts. Our community has increasingly looked to people and to these authors for thought leadership. In this way, it's paradigmatic of the way in which the production of content not only influences through its substance, but it leads to the creation of new, positive influencers. To me, this is the power the information age holds for the modern Orthodox community. We need to build the right kind of infrastructure so that our future leaders can learn to educate and inspire and produce content that is uniquely modern Orthodox. And we need to incentivize people to use the power of the information age in ways consonant with our values so that our future leaders and influencers can reflect those values. When it comes to content, you reap what you sow, and it's time for our community to invest in the long term.
Okay, now I'm not going to follow that.
Yeshikach, and thank you to my co-panelists for really framing all of the questions so well. And it's a really great pleasure and privilege for me to be here myself. And I want to just jump in and make a couple of perspectives, both as a pulpit rabbi and a rabbi in a community that by definition, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, that sees tremendous and ongoing dynamic change that is almost, as Rabbi Penner said, month to month. And also the perspective of an outsider. My accent, which I'm no longer sure exactly what it is certainly not Brooklyn. And I come from different shores and with a slightly different perspective. Change, globalization, social media, leadership, the nexus of questions, or the group of questions we're discussing today, obviously very, very critical. And throughout many issues, many challenges, many opportunities. It's heartening to hear from all. I'm a huge fan of Lehrhaus, and it's fascinating to hear. And I'm a consumer, a beneficiary of the tremendous leadership through our rabbinic interns and a new generation of students and rabbis that Yeshiva University is producing. They tell a story about a shul that decided to build a new building, and of course, one of the very great questions was, what should we write above the Aron Kodesh? What verse or what statement best epitomizes what we as a community stand for? And after much polling and much argument, the consensus was they wrote above the Aron Kodesh, but that's the way we've always done it here. By definition, we talk about change, but we have a leadership culture, and it's important to understand this, and I see this as a shul rabbi as well. Change can be challenging. And change, if it is not embraced and explained properly, risks alienating the people who are most invested in an institution and in a relationship. It's all very well saying to a shul or to a community, you need to change. But if what you're saying is, so the people who've worked tirelessly, who've shown up, who've constantly been the pillars of the community, we're replacing you, or we now need you to give way to certain often unidentified populations, the mythical millennials who are going to come in and take over the leadership, that can be enormously threatening. There's a statement, at least we Brits use, taking coals to Newcastle. So I'm very, very leery of taking Divrei Torah to Yeshiva University. But allow me to say this. I was actually at a meeting this week of a bunch of rabbis at the OU headquarters, and one particular rabbi created the tremendous faux pas of couldn't stop talking about the sermons that he'd given over the course of it, so nobody wants to hear. But I'll phrase it this way. Noach, almost the most overlooked word in the famous question about how come Noach wasn't the influencer that he should have been. Tamim haya bedorotav. Noach was perfect in his generation. And the Noam Elimelech actually points out that every generation has a task that it has to do. But Noah's greatness was the fact that, in fact, the Torah doesn't say bedorotav. It doesn't say in his generation. It says in his generations. Noah was an individual who lived for centuries, who lived through multiple generations, and in fact was able to renew his relevance, his perfection in every generation. That is much harder than it sounds, because one day the millennials will also say, well, when I was young, we didn't do it this way. And back when I was in Smicha, we would never have dared with such an innovation. And that's important to recognize. The world moves on, even for people who advocate change. Change will one day be threatening. But more importantly, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky asks, and I promise it's not just Devar Torah, this is really relevant to our discussion at hand. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky asks the following question. Noah didn't rebuke, didn't talk, didn't reach out to anybody. And he answers, of course he did. But he reached out with the questions that weren't relevant. In that generation, the issue was not whether people believed in God or worshipped idols. The question was whether people stole and were corrupt. Noah couldn't stop rebuking or engaging with the generation with the question that they weren't interested in, and didn't matter to them. And this, of course, for religious people and for Orthodox institutions and for modern Orthodox institutions is the critical question. Both how do we engage, how do we produce that content, and how do we make our timeless content relevant, and at the same time, how do we make sure that we address the priorities that actually matter. Torah will never stop being relevant to people, and the need for religious institutions to provide a home for everybody will never tire. But our danger or our opportunity is to make sure that what we're offering is what the generation of the particular time needs. So let me make just a couple of observations about how to do that. First of all, and a lot was said about social media, and I was actually wondering why I was invited to panels. It's good to know that because I'm an oversharer on Facebook that I came to the attention of the new powers that be, Yeshiva University. It is very, and as Rabbi Helfand, or Dr. Helfand alluded to, it is Rabbi Helfand as well, and
just call me out.
It is social media, and it provides content. And the danger, of course, is it provides, as he points out, clickbait. And to differentiate between the two can be very, very difficult. As a synagogue rabbi, and as a user, and maybe an oversharer on social media, and nonetheless try to draw a very personal and very firm red line, which is social media can never replace actual interaction and actual real-life engagement. I have to be honest, I'm not interested in being the rabbi of somebody who lives thousands of miles away. And even though somebody might engage with the Devar Torah that I post on Facebook or share on Twitter, at the end of the day, that person needs their own rabbinic engagement. I'm interested in the people who walk through the portals of Lincoln Square Synagogue, members or not, because religion has always stood for, and rabbinic leadership has always stood for real rabbinic engagement, personal engagement. And the danger is that either celebrity culture or the mass media culture or all of the ills that Dr. Helfand pointed out can replace a genuine engagement. You can't really answer a shaila, a question, for somebody that you never met. But you certainly cannot be a religious figure. You cannot be a warm guide. You cannot embrace physically, but even metaphorically. And the danger of social media and ultra-globalization is that we're going to replace actual engagement, an actual feeling of warmth, of inclusion, of being welcomed, of being made to feel at home, of being made to feel matter in a shul or a school or an actual community with virtual communities. Virtual communities, for our intents and purposes, are virtually worthless. One sincere danger, and something which every religious leader has to be exceptionally careful about. There are no secrets anymore in the world. And saw this last couple of weeks with, for those of you on social media, the hashtag #MeToo trends. People coming forward with genuine stories of hurt and abuse, the danger, possibly the near catastrophe that could cause to actual institutions of the Jewish community. There used to be a culture in all Jewish communities, all religious communities, based on Lashon Hara, based on not wanting to hurt individuals, based on a certain sense of deference, that meant that people in power, we saw this in Hollywood as well, with Harvey Weinstein as well, were always protected. There was always a sense of cover-up. That is going away. That is going away exceptionally rapidly. And every institution and every individual active in religious leadership is vulnerable. And we mentioned before, as Dr. Novick mentioned before, it's not just a conversation about a Shabbos table that has the potential to be very, very negative. It is the fact that every single individual active in the Jewish community has to now act with even more integrity than before, because the clear dangers of anybody, every scandal is on the and from this point of view, there's no question about it, this is a tremendous blessing. There are no more secrets, and there can be no more cover-ups, and Jewish institutions are going to have to learn to adapt to this exceptionally quickly because, and I know speaking to the new generation of young couples, of young individuals who daven at Lincoln Square Synagogue, nothing is more repellent to idealistic young people looking to make their own home in the Jewish community than a sense of hypocrisy, than a sense of scandal, than a sense of cover-up. When rabbis get up and moralize, and they themselves are either guilty of or guilty of covering up other people's ethical lapses, it's not that they have no moral voice, they actually have a negative moral voice. And the very, very last thing is, and I wasn't present when Rabbi Sachs spoke this morning, but Rabbi Sachs has often pointed out that people often think that it's a job of a leader to create followers. In fact, he says, and I quote this line very often, the job of a leader is to create leaders. And to my mind, one of the things that the American Jewish community needs to learn to do more, I actually had a conversation with President Berman when he was first elected about this, is needs to invest in leadership more often as well. Dr. Novick pointed out that we give leadership opportunities of a certain limited nature to our teens. Growing up, and I must say growing up in a not particularly Jewishly observant community or as a particularly Jewish observant young man, from the earliest age, I and all of my peers were given genuine opportunities to lead. In America, the model of, for example, Hillel is a professionally run organization that provides admirably wonderful Jewish content to kids on campus. My early steps in Jewish leadership was, in fact, in the UK. Jewish campus leadership, Jewish student leadership is provided by students themselves. The difference is incredible. We invest in the UK, I should say they invest in the UK far more. My smicha in Israel was paid for by the Jewish community. My wife's Masters of Jewish Education was paid for in the Jewish community. The Jewish community invests more than invests in building and physical infrastructure, in leadership opportunities, in leadership training, in taking promising individuals, and in return for a commitment to work in the Jewish community for 3 years, for 5 years, for 10 years, provides them with the very, very, very best professional training. I was actually shocked sometimes to find out that an individual who wants to, for example, attend Yeshiva University, wants to attend Wurzweiler, wants to commit to working in the Jewish community, will nonetheless face an enormous tuition bill at the end just for the privilege of wanting to become a professionally qualified Jewish leader. So if we really are indeed serious about leadership, we have to understand that it's only people. Ultimately, it's not computers, it's not Facebook feeds, it's people's and their interaction with other people that truly matters. And if we want to make a difference, we have to invest in the traditional interface of person and community and the incredible synergy that provides.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We're going to open it up for questions if anybody has anything to share.
Rabbi Penner, I was very happy and surprised to learn that you run this situation with potential rabbi changes, how to deal with people, teach them interrelationships that may have changed from last year or the year before. What do you do with issues of halacha that completely change, and the answer you get from almost anybody, I can't do that, we have to wait for some gadol to come do it. And yet everyone admits that change has to be done. I'm particularly staying away from issues.
Thank you.
Because I don't want to be stoned. But there are issues out there that everyone says you're crazy. It's wrong. We have science. We have this. How do you guys handle it?
So I think it's important to understand that halacha doesn't change. Halacha is a system that is a closed system. It learns, it adapts in certain situations, but it doesn't simply change because realities on the ground may change. So I think two things that have to be done. First of all is that we need to develop a culture where it's okay to have high-level discussions about trends in the community and to figure out where that's going in halacha. And to engage the people themselves, as I spoke about, to bring in individuals who are seeking to make change and to be able to have real discussion with them, with the understanding that they're not halachists, they don't know how the system works, but at least to be able to understand the realities so that those who are big, have the big enough shoulders, can make those decisions. We are not, as an institution, in favor of our newly minted graduates making significant halachic changes or things like that on their own. The reality is that we don't train them for that ability in order to be able to understand the system. The second thing I think that's important is that sometimes the answer is going to be no. If the answer is always yes, then it's not a real system. And I think part of it is to understand how to say no and to understand how to defend Jewish tradition with the meaning that it is. No can't be a one-word answer. When people are coming with a particular issue, there are many underlying challenges. And no, it can't be a yes or no question. The answer may ultimately have to be no. I don't necessarily agree with the premise that there are things that just have to change.
The tradition was wrong. There wasn't enough knowledge when that tradition was put on, because the people weren't at that level of understanding.
So again,
we now have a new level of understanding.
Right.
Point blank, those guys were wrong.
Right. So good. So there are times where, for example, and then we'll go to another question, where, for example, there's a medical issue in the Talmud, and the medical issue does not necessarily seem to be, correct from a medical perspective. Okay. So I think that within our world and in many, many communities, the poskim are very open to that possibility. But halacha has survived till this point because decisions have been made by people with 30 and 40 years of training and not 3 or 4. And I think that if we change that reality, the same scientific information that's available to those who've had 3 or 4 years of training is available to those who've had 30 and 40. And we need to have the right people making the decisions.
If I may, just as a pulpit rabbi, if I may, first of all, it's astonishing actually the way that halacha, for all the allegations that it's an out-of-touch system, is astonishingly on matters of technology and medical science and halacha and ethics and all sorts of it, is astonishingly contemporary. And you speak to real poskim, real genuine poskim, it's astonishing about the how okaran they are with medical halachic technological advances. Mm-hmm. I would say, if I may, just one perspective. Came across, I'm quite a student of history, and Professor Jeffrey Gurek of this institution wrote a wonderful book about the history of Orthodox Judaism in this country. He describes a vignette, a scene. There used to be an organization called the Uptown Talmud Torah. It was a Talmud Torah, an after-school program for Hebrew, the equivalent of before day schools, where many hundreds of kids in the Upper West Side. This is around the era of the late 19 teens and 20s. At a certain point, a shocking innovation was proposed that caused the Rebbeim, the teachers of this institution, to go on strike. And they struck because they felt that they had to uphold the kavod, the dignity of Torah. We're talking about an innovation without parallel, without any precedent in Jewish education, that they felt threatened to undermine the entire Masorah of how we teach Torah to the younger generation. It was the institution of a magic lantern, an old-fashioned slideshow, to teach Bible to the Talmud Torah kids. And the Rebbeim went on strike because they were horrified about this innovation. You go into any classroom today, of course, you see the latest technology. The point that I'm trying to make is that we have to be very, very careful, and this is why I think, and I speak to the interns who I work with very closely at Yeshiva University, which is why I've got tremendous admiration for the way that Yeshiva University in particular does this. We have to be able to, at the same time, exceptionally deferential to the Masorah, and aware of the fact that although halacha does not change, sometimes and by necessity and by opportunity, psak halacha changes. The actual answer for a particular generation may be different. And that's why, as an aside, we have to be very careful about painting ourselves into a corner. Many issues, and I, as a former campus rabbi, see this. The way that a JLIC rabbi will be instructed by Rosh Yeshiva to handle a particular question will be different from the way if a pulpit rabbi, will phone up and ask the same question. But we have to be very, very careful about painting ourselves into a corner of using absolute terms of forbidden, asur, prohibited, for things that in the future may well become acceptable, because the halachic system does indeed run the risk of being made to look out of touch when it insists that things are forbidden until one day they're permitted. And I'll just, and I don't want to overuse the time, in England, where I guess I must be more nostalgic for the UK than I ever thought I was. In England, for many, many years, it was forbidden by the London Bet Din to have women synagogue presidents. And the reason was, it was because it was against halakha. And then one day it became permitted. And the Dayanim, the heads of the Bet Din, had this very awkward task of explaining halakha doesn't change, but now it's permitted to have women synagogue presidents. And the mistake that they made was explaining something in terms of a black and white blanket prohibition against halakha, as opposed to trusting their audience to be able to have a more sophisticated conversation about why something why halakha has to adapt to changing social realities when necessary, when appropriate. Okay, that's it. I'm going to say anything.
Actually, I have two passions that have to do with leadership, but I don't know which of the two questions to ask. One is, I've been following what's been going on campus. I've been following what's been going on campus for the last 3 years or more, and I'm interested in how, I know about SSI, and I know about some other organizations that are teaching the kids to respond.
Speak louder.
I'm concerned about what's going on campus. And I know that there are groups that in the last 3 or 4 years have come out and they start to develop materials and workshops and opportunities for Jewish young people to respond to what's going on. But I think that the pace at which this is going on and the forces that are at play here on campus are such that we're really behind the eight ball. I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about how to develop leadership among our young people to combat what's going on campus. That's my one question. My other question is more direct.
I'm sorry, let's keep the questions
Yeah.
together. What particular aspect of campus do you find? And which campuses? General college campuses?
College campuses.
Throughout the country.
And what particular issue?
The issue, well, SJP and all of the negative propaganda against both Jews and Israel, and how many of our young people are part of that. They're actually promoting this negative image erroneously.
Okay, so how are we empowering students, community members, community leaders to face the contemporary challenges on American college campuses with respect to anti-Semitism, anti-Israel bias? Where are they getting this information from? Where they're getting this training from? And how is this being addressed?
Is any one of us a professor on a secular campus?
Just one thought I have
There's
is
some real
that
professionals over there.
is that it is a mistake to think that this begins on the college campus and that the preparation for dealing with this has to begin on the college campus, particularly because content is king and at much younger ages, people have access to all kinds of content. We have to create educated consumers from very early ages. And we have to recognize that very young children are exposed to much broader types of information than ever before, and they need to be given the skills and the core identity that allows them to, to hear that from a place of security and safety. Yes, there are specific programs out there, and we could always do more and use more. But I think that we have to look to the mechanisms, the existing mechanisms and strength of Jewish education and say, how are we creating identity, pride, knowledge, and belief in third grade, such that it translates into 5th grade and 7th grade and onward.
I'll jump in for a second. With regards to the Israel issue, I really just want to echo on a variety of fronts what Dr. Novick just said in terms of the education we provide our young adults in elementary school and high school. One of the things, again, that typifies the information age is access to all different kinds of information. I think our schools for too long provided a curated view of Israel's history for our students. And they wanted them to hear certain things and not other things. And the goal was to inspire in our students an undying love of Israel, and as it should be. That being said, in so doing, in our fervor to do that, we edited stuff out. And we provided a particular version of things without the complete picture, such that in a way, when they showed up on the college campus, they didn't know the ABCs, or maybe they knew A, B, and C, but we left out D, E, and F. And as a result, they were overwhelmed. I think we need to realize that the time for editing content is over. I think we need to provide students and with a full-on view of Israel's complicated history and find ways to inspire in them an undying love for the country, notwithstanding some of the challenges. Because otherwise, we're going to go from 60 to 0, so to speak. They're going to come out of high school and have all these views and be crushed under what they see on college campuses. We need to produce more sophisticated consumers. And let me just pull a pitch back to what I said before. Modern Orthodox community is the best served to do this. I mean, we pull together expertise from a wide range of disciplines. There are a number of high schools in the United States that are doing excellent jobs providing far more thoughtful and complete histories of the politics and culture of Israel, and finding ways to use that complex history to inspire students nonetheless. If we don't do that, we're going to be sending our students and our children into like a gunfight with a spoon, and that just doesn't work anymore.
I would be remiss if I didn't also point out that while we can't retreat from the reality of what's going on the college campuses, and we can't pretend that what's going on the college campuses isn't important for the future of our community, regardless of whether we send our kids in with a spoon or with a gun, it's a time to really ask why we're sending our kids into a gunfight. And I think that I would be remiss to say that's why students need to be at Yeshiva University, because college campuses are more hostile than ever. And yes, a few people can be there and make the arguments, but that's just another reason for people to be here.
I'm just going to say that the majority of people on college campuses are not necessarily from the modern Orthodox community, but they represent huge numbers of Jewish.
Of course they do. That's right.
Thank you so much. We just want to thank the panel so much for their insights and their